Welcome along to a very special Leeds Trinity University and the Yorkshire Voice celebration of one of the podcast phenomenons of 2021. Yes, the Battersea Poltergeist. And if you've been as hooked and addicted on it as I have, and my co-host tonight, Dr. Rebecca Whittington, then you're definitely in for a ride tonight, because we've got the creator, director, and writer of the Battersea Poltergeist, and that is Danny Robbins is with us this evening. Danny, how are you doing?
I'm very good, thank you. Thank you for having me.
Absolutely marvellous to have you with us. And of course, with us as well, my name's Darren Harper, but Dr. Rebecca Whittington, big Battersea Poltergeist fan, is with us as well. How are you doing?
Yeah, I'm great. I'm so excited to be here today talking to Danny about the podcast, because it's uniting two of my favourite things, which are journalism and the supernatural. So, yeah, I couldn't be happier.
Well, I'm fully ghostbusted up, so it's he's up there and he's on there as well. So I'm fully prepared. Fully prepared for tonight, Danny. Let's start, first of all, obviously, let's start right at the beginning. How did the Battersea Poltergeist come about for you, and how did you get involved in it?
Well, yeah, I mean, it was one of those amazing moments where the story of your lifetime falls into your lap. I was doing a series called Haunted, which was a podcast series where I got people to tell me their ghost experiences, and each episode was an individual ghost story. And one of the people I worked with on that series was a guy called Alan Murdy, who's a senior figure in ghost hunting circles in the UK. And also, quite beautifully, like Harold Chibbett in the Battersea Poltergeist story, who was Chibbett was a tax investigator. Alan is a tax lawyer, defending people in council tax claims. So little parallel there. But Alan said to me, I've got this case. There's a lot of documentary material there. There's these boxes of files on the case. The woman it happened to is still alive. And do you want to talk to her? And I said, yeah. And so I went and talked to Shirley and found out about the story. And as soon as I heard it, I could see that this very clearly wasn't a single episode of Haunted. It was something much, much bigger. It was a case that spanned 12 years with such a rich array of phenomena, so many interesting story points, and also against this incredible backdrop of the Second World War, when there's this boom of interest in the paranormal because of Europe trying to process the huge loss of life and the trauma of the war, but then also this kind of interesting thing of the anxiety of the 50s. The Suez War crisis was just kicking off that year in 1956. You've got the whole explosion of kind of the modern teenager, essentially. In 1956 is the month the haunting starts, is the month that Elvis releases Heartbreak Hotel, and James Dean has just died, and the whole kind of explosion of teen culture. So there was so much to this story that drew me in, and from that point on I was hooked, and at that point I started working out a way to try and make this happen as a series.
And take us back to sort of like Haunted and sort of how you got sort of involved in that. Is this always been like a passion for you? Is this sort of paranormal investigation?
Well, I mean, yes, I think so is the short answer. I mean, I've had this interest in, I would say, belief in general. I was brought up in a household that was devoutly atheist, but by a mum who had been a Catholic. She'd been brought up at a school taught by nuns, and had railed against Catholicism and left the fold, essentially. And so I was brought up in this belief-free zone, but was quite intrigued by it, and was interested by visits to my grandparents, where I saw the pictures of Jesus looming down at me from the wall, and the books about popes, and I was fascinated by the idea of, was there something more out there? And I think that fed in to just, I think the interest in ghosts grew out of that, but also clearly I loved lots of ghost stories growing up as a kid, and watched things like Ghost Watch, which people of my sort of age will remember as a kind of real profound memory of childhood. The kind of the program on the BBC, which people thought was a real investigation and turned out to be very cleverly dramatized by Stephen Volk, but was incredibly scary and brought a record number of complaints for the BBC. So lots of things like that fed in to my interest. And just over the years, I've found myself doing things about ghosts, and often comedically, because most of my career has been spent writing and making comedy. So I did a comedy show at the Edinburgh Festival, which was a kind of pastiche of Most Haunted. And yeah, and just, I find myself increasingly becoming more and more interested. And I started writing a play. I had an idea for a play which sprang from a moment where a friend of mine told me she'd seen a ghost. And I just was really interested in that moment where somebody says, I've seen a ghost, and the effect that has on those around them. And if you are surrounded by people who are skeptics, it brings about a kind of a moment of tension, essentially, and I got interested in the idea of this happening within a relationship. So I started writing a play about somebody who believed that they'd seen a ghost in their house and their partner who was a staunch skeptic, and the effect that had on their relationship. And as part of the research process for the play, I just put a shout out on social media saying, has anybody I know seen a ghost? And I thought I might get one or two, and I was deluged. And so many people who, this sounds like an odd thing to say, people who I thought wouldn't have seen a ghost, had seen a ghost. And I realized it was way more prevalent than people think. And I got so many good ghost stories coming in, and Haunted grew out of that, just a desire to do something with these stories and to give people a space where they could tell them. And so really Haunted grew from that, and then Battersea Poltergeist grew from Haunted.
It's just amazing, isn't it? How the response that you've got, by the sounds of it, to Battersea Poltergeist, which I've seen unfolding on Twitter. You have generated a kind of zeitgeist of 2021, which has given people escapism and, really got people talking and excited and wanting to take part. And it's so interesting that it stemmed from that previous history as well. So can you tell us a bit about that participatory element with the making of this podcast, and how you kind of get that balance of people giving you their stories and then what you pick and choose to respond to?
Yeah, I mean, I think I really don't want to use the words we benefited from coronavirus, but I think we found a moment where people were very hungry for entertainment, hungry to be entertained. And I think particularly people are really reaching for audio at the moment. And I think people are developing a relationship again with their radio or with audio in general that maybe they haven't had for a long time. And, and clearly it's been possible to produce audio during lockdown in a way that it isn't really possible to produce TV, and it certainly isn't possible to produce live, theatre or comedy. And this was a lockdown project. It was commissioned pretty much the week that we went into the first lockdown, and we have made it throughout lockdown. And we've had moments where gloriously it's opened up a little bit, and we've been able to go out on location. And, we were able to get the actors into a studio in the summer to do the drama sections. But it has very much been a lockdown project. And I think, the audience connect with that. They sort of realize that. And I think also there is this parallel between the fact that the family were locked down back in 1956. They had this very claustrophobic relationship with their house where they had these frightening things going on inside the house, but they also had this intrusive press interest outside. Their house was at points surrounded by a press pack, and they couldn't leave. And so I think, you can see parallels there. And I think we all identify with the sense of being claustrophobically cooped up in our house, and the idea of your house becoming a character in your life, that you come to know it so well that you simultaneously kind of feel safe nowhere else, but also resent these four walls that encroach on you at all times. So I think, there was clearly a lockdown moment. And then, I think I always had this idea of wanting to build a community around the show. And that was partly inspired by true crime podcasts, of which I'm an avid consumer. And I really have a very strong memory of listening to Serial, which was, I know for many people was an entry point into podcasts. And for me was probably the first podcast I really realized was a podcast and connected with. And I remember meeting up with some friends in the pub to talk about the case with Serial and to say, do you think he's guilty or innocent? How do you think it happened? And I just loved the idea of building that again. And I also was inspired by a show called Up and Vanished, which was another true crime podcast by a guy called Payne Lindsay. And he very cleverly built a community around the show by dropping like case updates episodes in between episodes where he had the experts discussing the case in more detail, and listeners could like call in and leave a message on a phone line and, their messages would be read out, their questions would be read out. And so I was inspired by those, and I wanted to bring that true crime approach to a ghost story and treat, even though this was a historical case, treat it like an open investigation. And clearly that's worked. People have really related to that, and people have been brilliant at sending us emails and on social media, sending us their questions, their theories, their own ghost stories, to the point where I've even been told that Battersea Library now has a corner of the library set aside to the case, because so many people have been asking them for maps and documents. So that's been brilliant. But I think, it has been this desire for something to do in lockdown. And I think the fact that we chose not to release everything in one box set, but we released it week by week, allowed it to build in that way. People wanted to know what happened next, and people had time to think about the case. They had a week to think about their theories, and then maybe those theories would be knocked completely out by what happened in the next episode, and they'd have to rebuild again from there. But I think the very nature of the serial element of it, the fact that we released it over 8 weeks or 7 weeks, I think allowed it to build. And by the time we got to the end of the series and we were doing listen-alongs for the final 2 episodes, where everybody who wanted to take part could press play at the same time and listen simultaneously and then comment on Twitter. By the time we got to that, we'd already built this community. So there was a group out there that wanted to take part. And I think then the listen-alongs brought it to an even bigger audience, because people were hearing about it through that. And it's just been beautiful for me. I've absolutely loved the fact that it's created a community, and a community that's incredibly respectful and open-minded. I think a lot of people have said that in an age where we are defined as much by what we are not as what we are, and we are constantly seeking ways to argue with each other, and everything, all debate seems sometimes to be incredibly binary and, incredibly about, I disagree with you and I hate this. And, it's actually, this was a subject that could have generated that kind of debate. Belief and skepticism are absolute opposites, but somehow people have come together and been very respectful and very accepting of each other's beliefs. And that's been, for me, one of the nicest takeaways from all of this, I think.
Yeah, I think you're right. I think the way that sort of like group mentality sort of like got together on the podcast was absolutely amazing, really. And also, it sort of brought me back to how good social media could be, because it can be quite a toxic place at the worst of times. And it was just so nice just to be tweeting about something that wasn't. Or you're engaging in something that was like really positive, and like it just felt lovely. It's what I remember Twitter was like when it first started.
And I think I have to say, like a big part of that is Shirley. I feel that Shirley is this amazing, warm presence at the heart of the show that people connect with, and I've been able to see through the emails coming in and the social media just how much warmth there is towards her, and she's somebody that people trust and people have gone on this journey with. And, any ghost story is only as good as its teller, and any documentary is only as good as the contributors at the heart of it. And here we have somebody who's a really powerful storyteller who feels trustworthy and truthful and very real and ordinary in a kind of nice sense, in that she's like us, we feel like, a lot of ghost stories, and particularly a lot of poltergeist stories, seem to revolve around a kind of troubled family. Often you feel like there is an unhappiness at the heart of the story that manifests itself, whether you believe that's, if you're a paranormal believer, you believe that somehow the spirit draws on the energy of the bad energy of the situation, or if you're a skeptic, you believe that maybe, it's the troubled minds of these people that is causing this situation. But that's kind of absent in our story. It feels like a happy family, and Shirley feels like a very well-balanced individual. And I think that's really grounded everything, and it makes it feel incredibly truthful and believable. And also it's given people this, just people kind of really, really root for Shirley, and I think even the people who were real skeptics kind of didn't want it to be a hoax. They didn't want it to be disproved because they were so rooting for Shirley. I just think that that's been brilliant for me as a documentary maker, to find a contributor who is such a powerful storyteller and such a lovely presence at the heart of it. Has been great.
The things that you've just said, there's a couple of things that you said in that which are just so true. Shirley's voice is so strong throughout this, both the dramatized voice and also she's been brought in and spoken to you. She's we've heard her voice on the podcast as well. For telling this kind of story where you're relying on testimony mainly from the past, and documents from the past, and then obviously bringing in this one person that's the sole survivor from this, did you worry at any point about how the story was going to play out and how things were going to unfold and the effect that might have on Shirley?
Yes. I always felt a strong duty of care to Shirley, and was really aware and conscious of how we managed the fact that there was inevitably a pull between belief and skepticism, and that if you tell a ghost story, there will be people who want to disprove it. And indeed, some of the dramatic tension came from that roller coaster journey going between is it real, is it not? We posed that question in the first episode: is it a haunting or a hoax? And I was aware that this is a story that Shirley has held for 65 years, and this is her life, and so I felt a duty of care there, and hopefully people who've listened to it and listened to the whole series feel that that was managed, and that was the way we set about trying to tell the end of the story, and those elements of the story always placed our duty of care to Shirley at the heart of it. For me, one of the nice things is I feel like Shirley was a victim of the press back in 1956. She was definitely exploited by several quite dodgy older male figures. You see, Ronald Maxwell, the Daily Mail journalist. There's, Harry Hanks, the exorcist. There's, you could argue that even Chib, as lovely as Chib is and as avuncular as he is, there is an argument to be made that he perpetuates things and sort of exacerbates the haunting in a way, and certainly feeds fear potentially, I think. But the press coverage is absolutely salacious and prurient, and Shirley is viewed through this very seedy male gaze of portraying her as this, talking about like her spook lover, and she's referred to as like some of the American coverage we found. The story went as far afield as local newspapers in America, and they kept using this term "pert bobby soxer," which horribly kind of 50s sexualized term. So I felt like, back in the 50s, she was exploited and she was a victim of the press. And then now she's had this second brush with fame. She's been on ITV's This Morning. She's been on breakfast TV in Australia, and she's had these 2-page spreads in every newspaper. Literally every tabloid has covered it. And the great thing for me is that this time round, it's on her terms. She's telling the story the way she wants to tell it, and she's in control. And so I just think that's really powerful. And there was a lovely moment where the Daily Mirror ran this piece on the story, and in it they had a little photograph of the original article they wrote about the case in 56, and they were the first newspaper to run a story on this: mystery noises that haunt Shirley. And that felt so cyclical, and there she was as a teenager, somebody who'd been sucked into this kind of maelstrom of becoming a celebrity in an age where it just really wasn't the norm for an ordinary person to become a celebrity. And then here she was, aged 80, kind of enjoying the second brush with fame. And I think it's been therapeutic. I think she's been able to kind of process a lot of what happened to her. And, we have sort of tried to move towards looking at answers for what happened to her. And so I think, she's enjoyed the process. And I think she's certainly felt like hearing her family and Chibbett brought to life for the drama has been a powerful and emotive thing. And I think she really does feel that has been a truthful process. And she, feels that it's authentic. And that for me was a very important part of it. And I guess, if you could say one thing as a documentary maker, it's that you want your subject to still be talking to you at the end of the process. And I feel like a lot of modern documentaries may not have that, because I feel like there is certainly a sort of a strand of documentary making that is quite exploitative. And it would have been very possible to do a different version of this where Shirley didn't come out of it so well or wasn't so happy with how it was processed. And I know that there have been, she's been approached by one or two people in the past who had quite sort of schlocky, kind of cheesy, kind of, horror takes on this, and I think she definitely reacted well and identified with the fact that we did a more sensitive take on the story.
Well, I'm interested then because you mentioned Serial earlier on and it's one of my favorite. It was certainly one of my entries into podcast, and just how that was produced and how beautifully it was produced as well. And you can see a lot of similarities with the Battersea Poltergeist podcast because it is really beautifully produced. I'm just wondering your entry into it and how you sort of like planned out how you were going to do it, because it does use so many different sort of elements. And I'm just wondering that process of you sort of sitting down and scripting it and looking at it. How was that process for you?
Yeah, I mean, from the beginning, I decided I wanted to have it pretty much 50-50 documentary and drama. And I'd experimented with that in a show I'd made for Audible, I think maybe 2-3 years ago, called Folsom Untold, which told the story of Johnny Cash's Folsom prison concerts. And I told it across 5 episodes as a cliffhanger with, cliffhanger endings to the episodes. And on a much lower budget, I'd experimented with using drama. And it just seemed to me to be a brilliant way to, very appropriately for our subject, to bring the dead to life. And if you had, interesting characters and interesting moments that you didn't have archive footage for, and you didn't have the interviewees living, you could bring that to life, and it could make it feel quite vital and fresh. And so I really wanted to kind of develop that for Battersea Poltergeist. And I was a bit nervous about how that would work, because I do think that the audiences for audio drama and the audiences for, say, true crime podcasts or paranormal podcasts don't necessarily overlap. And there was always a sort of wariness that people might feel like one was getting in the way of the other. And I'm enjoying the documentary side, but here comes the drama scene, or I'm really getting into the drama, and then here's this bloke talking about the case. Why is he doing that? So that was a consideration. And I think I got a really good steer early on from Rhiannon Roberts, the commissioner, who said, think of the drama as one of the tools at your disposal in the investigation. And it was great because it just made me think like, okay, so we'll go to this when we need it, and it's not just like, okay, drama scene ends, documentary scene starts. It's like this will flow out of the documentary. And so as soon as we started adding in, little lines of Shirley's interviews to the drama, it just instantly grounds it and makes it feel real. But in terms of the process, obviously we had to have the drama ready far in advance of recording a lot of the documentary stuff, because we had a window when we could get the actors. And, I took the time writing the scripts. And once we'd recorded the scripts, that was set, we couldn't change it. So we knew that was going to be a sort of finite part of the show. And so I'd worked out what I felt the trajectory I wanted to tell was, the story I wanted to tell was. And, I spent ages and ages going through the case and trying to distill 12 years worth of, a huge, amazing amount of phenomena into that story, that 8-part story. And trying to imagine what the documentary bits to complement it would be. And then actually, when it came to recording the documentary stuff after the drama, I often found that actually I didn't want to tell the story quite in the order I thought I did. And so then I was moving drama around. And actually some drama that was meant to be in episode 2 might have ended up in episode 4. And, a scene that was meant to be the end scene of an episode might end up being the beginning scene of an episode. So, we were able to move things around, but we were tied to a certain trajectory on the story. So I had to be fairly confident that did work. We didn't have any ability, having landed the likes of Toby Jones and Daphne Keane, and you get them, like in Toby's case, literally for one day. So we didn't have an ability to go back and say, sorry, Toby, do you just mind recording that line again? But that, in a way, that was a restraint in one way, but also it was a great thing to know. It was a real security blanket to know that we'd recorded this drama, and it felt like it was probably good. It felt like we had good performances. So, knowing that you had that as your bedrock was great, and you knew that was kind of 50% of every episode. And then the documentary parts of it led us in different directions. And sometimes I was like, oh, we really need this kind of interviewee. Let's go and find somebody who can talk to us about that. But it all slotted in nicely into that overarching story arc, which I guess gave us a lot of sense of purpose, really. It gave us a direction that we were working towards the whole way through. So sometimes, to generate literally an 8-part documentary would be incredibly daunting, I think, and a much more sprawling task. And when you're working on a podcast and you're working on a relatively low budget, you don't have those, just infinite amount of time and infinite amount of staff that you'd have on some big TV documentary, or even, like you listen to Serial or S-Town, those kind of shows, and you hear how many people were involved, and they've got a fact checker. Like, I dream of the day I can have somebody who's a fact checker on my show, somebody a paid role as a fact checker. But it was pretty much Simon Barnard, my co-producer, and me, who were making this together as a 2-man band, and we had people doing our sound design, our music and so on. But in terms of the content, the speech content, it was down to us, So I think the fact that we had the drama there, and that was 50% of the show, sort of made it all a bit more manageable. We always felt like we've got that in the bank.
Did you feel like because obviously the drama is that it's a huge part of the storytelling element to it, and it does bring it to life utterly. Did you run past the drama side of things with Shirley at all, or how did you get the words and put them to the actors and know that what you were saying was kind of truthfully reflective of what must have gone on?
The drama scenes are born from various sources. They're born from hours of interviews with Shirley that I did before I even sort of went near a page to write it. And they're also, born out of Chib's notes and the newspaper articles at the time, where sometimes people are quoted directly. Chib's voice comes through from his notes. There's the family's diaries. The voice comes through. I mean, a brilliant research aid throughout this was the book that Shirley wrote with James Clark in, I think, 2013, called The Poltergeist Prince of London, which is a really brilliant kind of exhaustive study of the case. James Clark did a fantastic research job there, like just going through all the material over several years and really going into a lot of detail. So conversations with James and, using the book as a reference point was really helpful. So the one thing our case does have is a lot of reference material. It's different to Enfield, the Enfield Poltergeist, which is a much more famous case. And the reason it's famous is because a TV crew went on site quite early in the process. And then that TV footage was then able to go onto YouTube when YouTube started. And talking to Ros Morris, one of the journalists who was at Enfield, she said, the legend of Enfield comes from YouTube. It comes from the internet age where people were hungrily looking for ghost stories, and Enfield presented this amazing story. So it's grown and grown and grown. We didn't have that. So our case was much more under the radar, but we did have this treasure trove of research material to draw on, much more than probably any other case. Chib's notes were day by day and, just huge and exhaustive. So we knew so much about the case and we were able to draw on material quite confidently, and we weren't just relying on Shirley's testimony, because I don't think I would have felt comfortable making something that was just reliant on one person saying this is true. So we had several sources. We were able to back it up. We had journalists who spent the night in the house. You had the reports of the police department, the fire department. So there was all that to draw on, and all of that fed into the scripts. But ultimately, of course, I had to kind of reimagine this. I had to create voices for these characters that you hope are authentic and truthful. But, I was putting words into characters' mouths to make it work, because we don't have, word for word transcripts of what everybody said over that 12-year period, of course. So you just kind of go with your instincts. You try to be truthful to the story, and you're creating this world. And at the same time, you're conscious as a, storyteller of trying to make it make dramatic sense. And sometimes, you conflate several journalists into one character, or you kind of slightly reorder the sequence of events in a way that doesn't affect, the story doesn't affect the truth of the situation, but you just try and make it make a bit more sense. But yeah, I mean, ultimately it boils down to a lot of material, both from Shirley's interviews and from those files, the records that we had access to, that I was drawing on constantly. So it was a great sort of, what's the word, a kind of great bedrock to build on.
I'm intrigued as well of when you're doing the investigative part of this, and you're writing the parts of the drama as well along the same time. Was there anything that really sort of like surprised you during your investigation of it? Because like you say, you'd spoken to Shirley quite a lot, but then you're obviously going into other areas and finding out all these other things. Was there anything that really sort of like surprised you? You left us on a cliffhanger every episode. It was a night. Was there anything that sort of surprised you and left you on a bit of a cliffhanger before you found out?
Oh yeah, I mean, I begin the series by saying I'm Danny Robbins and I don't believe in ghosts, is what I would have said to you before I found this case. And I mean, I sort of still stand true to that, really. I do think there is, a phenomenal amount of really inexplicable moments in this case. And there is a mystery at the heart of it. And, all the best ghost stories need to be fairly robustly skeptic proof. They need to have enough mystery at the heart of them that they defy explanation. And at the end of this series, we've offered possible explanations. There's a kind of sense of a choose your own adventure element to it. If you're a believer, there are explanations for you. And if you're a skeptic, there are explanations for you. But, do any of the explanations truly explain everything that happens in the case? No, probably not. Because I think, we wouldn't still be talking about this case now if we just neatly solved it. And, there wouldn't be, anybody would want to come and listen to this podcast if their mate could just say, oh, by the way, in the final episode, this is what happens and it's all solved. It retains a mystery. It's something that people will hopefully enjoy discussing and enjoy trying to solve themselves for, a long time to come. In terms of what surprised me most, I mean, I guess the thing that really surprised me most was just the sheer scale of this case, that I don't think I'd realized when I started looking into it, just how big it became. It really was front page news, and Shirley was on primetime television, and there were questions in the Houses of Parliament. The Home Secretary was talking about this case. And, we talk about Enfield as being this legend within ghost hunting, but actually in its time, Battersea was way bigger than Enfield was. Enfield's become bigger and bigger and bigger, but in 1956, this was huge. And just in this era where it wasn't normal for ordinary people to become famous. This was not the era of X Factor and reality television where we're like, not that surprised if the girl at number 63 suddenly becomes a TV sensation. But I think that's what I was really shocked by, the scale of it and trying to make sense of that. And hopefully that came across in the podcast. You see that this isn't just a ghost story. This is a story about a teenage girl becoming, having her life taken out of her own hands and becoming a sort of plaything for the media in a really distasteful way. And so I felt that the whole cultural and social and personal backdrop to the story is what really, really drew me in. And I think the more I immersed myself in the story, the more I became fascinated by those aspects of it. And I guess surprised to the extent to which this case in its day had become a real kind of cultural moment and a real sort of media phenomenon.
It's almost a bit like you've just talked really well about the fact that this has come at the right time, this podcast, because it's just kind of captured a moment in time where people needed something like that. Do you think in some ways the actual haunting of Shirley happened at the right time for the cultural society that took place in? Because we don't really hear of that kind of thing happening now. Well, we often look back in history, recent history, at that kind of haunting, but our society is much more perhaps skeptical or distracted, so we don't hear of that kind of thing taking place in our society right now. So do you think in some ways it kind of captured that moment in time, that post-war moment, just perfectly, and the appetite was there for this kind of story?
I think it absolutely does. I think you can see it's very much a product of its time, and like I said earlier, that coming together of those two things. I think the invention of the teenager as a concept in the 50s, and it's the first time that young people are really properly an entity in their own right, and an entity to be kind of wary of and feared to some extent. You see the films and the the music of the 50s is very much about teenagers as being this kind of rebel force, and adults, older adults and parents being wary. Why are these kind of the teddy boys and kind of teenage girls falling in love with the wrong guy, and this idea of doomed teenage love, the deaf discs of that era, Tell Laura I Love Her and Leader of the Pack. It all feeds into this case, married with that huge boom in paranormal interest after the war. So I think you certainly how the story is told in the press is absolutely a product of its time. And I mean, to do with your question about could those kind of cases happen now, it's really interesting because you see a major poltergeist case every 10 years or so, I'd say. In the 60s, there's the Black Monk of Pontefract, the case that we look at briefly in episode 6, which happened really near to where you guys are. It happened in Pontefract. And so that's a really big case that's as meaty as our case. And that's in the 60s, like literally 10 years later, 66 it says. And then you have Enfield, which is 77, 78. And then you don't really have a case on that scale happening after that. And a lot of people have asked me about, can a poltergeist case like this happen now? And, the skeptics say, is it that we're now living in the era of the smartphone? It's too easy to catch people out. And I think it's a really interesting question. I am personally fascinated by how ghosts can exist in the modern age. We've moved from an era of sort of darkly ill-lit streets and kind of creepy train platforms, and we're moving into a much more an area where we're flooded with light and we're constantly in contact with each other, and we are bombarded by information all the time. How do ghosts exist in the era of emails and text messages? And I'm fascinated by that idea, and about how I think personally I would find a ghost that sends emails incredibly believable, much more believable than a ghost that was trying to contact me through a medium and saying my name begins with one of the first 5 letters of the alphabet. You just need to work it out. I would find ghosts that embraced and used our modern technology incredibly plausible. And I personally think that there are a lot of cases out there, but I think there is a wariness and nervousness of talking about them. And certainly we put out this email, this Battersea Poltergeist at bbc.co.uk email at the end of episodes. And we've been bombarded by emails, and a lot of them have been questions and theories on the case, but a huge amount of them have been people talking about their own experiences. And I've been sent some really powerful stories about ghost experiences, and often from people who say, I don't believe in ghosts, but I've had this experience and I want to try and make sense of it. And so I think that, there was much more acceptance of ghosts and of the idea of somebody talking about being haunted in the past. And I think, in the 30s, there was this huge boom in ghost interest that stemmed back to the First World War and really kept going. There was this golden age of ghost hunting. Harry Price. There's a really interesting book out at the moment called The Haunting of Alma Fielding by Kate Summerscale, who wrote The Suspicions of Mr. Witcher, which talks about a poltergeist case in the 30s and looks at it from a very psychoanalytical perspective. But she talks in that book about this boom of poltergeist cases just before the Second World War, and sort of drawing a link between, the trouble in society, the kind of the nervousness of an impending major war and poltergeist cases. but there, that was a period when mediums were still filling theaters. Seances were rife, and the press would talk about hauntings and mediums, and mediums were like rock stars. It was openly discussed. We've moved into an age now where people don't talk about that anymore, and actually it's discouraged. And I think to some degree it feels taboo. People are kind of laughed at if people say they've had a ghost experience. And I think if somebody came out with a poltergeist case like Shirley's now, they would be possibly laughed at, possibly mocked. There would be people saying, are they mentally ill? I just don't think it would be treated in the same way and with the same kind of excitement and enthusiasm in an enjoyment of the case. Essentially, the press at the time of Shirley's case were really enjoying this coverage. It became a story that gripped the nation, and I can't see that happening in the same way. And I think that people are having these experiences, but they just don't feel comfortable talking about it, I think.
Do you think that there's a change in the way that we've sort of like got used to sort of like ghost stories as well? Because and you mentioned the BBC thing with pipes, and obviously like Most Haunted, and there's a lot more of like the entertainment factor of it. You can go and spend a night in a haunted house, and you can go with like a paranormal company. I've done it 2 times myself in like haunted pubs around York.
Yeah, me too.
So you can sort of like go and do these things now, which you never really could do when I was growing up. It wasn't sort of like possible. So I'm wondering if that sort of like had an impact, that it's more people are seeing this sort of like more of an entertainment and sort of like a gimmick rather than actually being something that could be quite real.
I think that's a brilliant point. I think you're right. It is entertainment, but it's entertainment that isn't taken seriously by the mainstream and by mainstream media. I was very influenced making Battersea Poltergeist by the energy of some of those shows. I mean, I remember watching Most Haunted when it first came out, and they used to do those big live events, Most Haunted Live, where they'd get an audience into some big haunted place, and they'd have Yvette and Derek Acora running around, and then they'd throw back to the presenters, and they're like, what's going on now? And I liked that energy of it, and I liked the idea of creating an event around it, and the investigation around it. But I guess I feel like those shows are very off-putting to skeptics. They're very much preaching to the converted. They're playing to an audience that are very, very firmly believers. And I wanted to create something that was equally appealing to believers and skeptics. And we'd done that with Haunted. I'd noticed with Haunted that worked, and that people who were believers listened to it and felt it was a show for them, and skeptics felt it was a show for them, and both people took away a very different conclusion to it, but enjoyed it equally. And I wanted to recreate that with Battersea Poltergeist. And for me, it was really important about not crossing over into that territory where it feels kind of very, I don't know if credulous is the right word, but sort of very accepting of all phenomena, that you're running around and just every little noise is a ghost, and it's all about the night vision cameras and just screaming, and I guess I wanted to do something that was I don't know, a little bit more that didn't take that position, that sort of straddled those two worlds, and so whilst I kind of appreciated the excitement of those shows, that definitely wasn't the direction I wanted to go down. And I think I know what you mean by I think those shows play a great role in providing entertainment, but they have also to some degree given ghosts a bad name amongst the mainstream. And I think some people, skeptics will now perceive ghosts as something that can be ridiculed to some degree, I think. And so I think the debate has very much moved in that direction. And so I think, we won't see a case being taken seriously in the way that Shirley's was. But I do dream of a moment where you could have that again. I think, these cases are fascinating, and they deal with the most serious matters imaginable. It's about life and death, I can see that our audience have enjoyed debating this, and it takes you into kind of quite philosophical territory about, is there a life after death? And for me, that's been a huge part of my interest in it. I'm somebody who had, at various points in my life, quite a real profound fear of death, actually, and still to some degree have that. And so I'm absolutely driven by that desire to kind of discover if there is something more to life. So yeah, I just think it's a fascinating debate, and actually, if you allow it to move into those more serious realms, then it's great. Why not sit down the pub and talk forever and ever about the nature of life and death? That's what we're all here to do.
Yeah, when we can get back in a pub.
I know. I mean, absolutely. I mean, this is, in my dream, we're sitting in the pub talking about this. At the moment, it's like this, virtually. We have to create our own pubs. I feel like mentally I'm sitting in the pub with you right now.
Yeah, we're definitely in the pub.
Sounds great.
Got a lot of questions.
Drinking my herbal tea in the pub, of course.
Yeah, fizzy water, and that's about it. This is so rock and roll. Let's look at a fair few questions coming through. So Steve asks, is Danny aware of automatic writing with regards to the letters? No, the letters, how long a period were the letters coming to Shirley?
I mean, the letters span a huge period. They start in 1956, sort of later in 56, and they keep going until the last sign of Donald in 1968. So they span a huge period of time. And, you heard in the series about our handwriting experts' theory on the letters, but as you also heard me say, there are lots of things about the letters that don't quite make sense. There are things in the letters that, it seems unlikely that Shirley would have known about. The sheer scale of the letters, the amount that are being pumped out, like 60 in a day, feels very hard to pull off. And also the letters, to some degree, it seems like they continue even after Shirley leaves home. So there's lots of strange things about the letters that we will explore a bit more in episode 9, our bonus episode that we're going to come back with at the beginning of April. But I mean, in terms of Steve's question, I mean, automatic writing, I mean, it's a really interesting point. And, there are plenty of cases of mediums and other people seeming to generate things from automatic writing. I mean, I think I'm right in saying the Book of Mormon is something that was supposedly generated by automatic writing. And it's interesting territory. And I think it's territory that scares Shirley to some degree. I mean, I know that the only thing that really kind of bothered her whilst we were talking about this case, and she said it gave her a nightmare afterwards, was that idea of her having been taken over by Donald, and that there was some degree of him possessing her and making her write the letters. And so I don't know. I mean, it's that is something that she definitely had a real effect on her, talking about that. And it's just so impossible to know, because I think, whether she wrote them consciously or unconsciously is so deeply buried now. This is 65 years on. And the one thing I am convinced by is that Shirley is totally convinced that she didn't write the letters. I believe that she is telling the truth when she says that. I don't think she's lying, but I don't think that discounts the possibility that she was writing them consciously at the time. I think it's possible that she was, and it's so deeply buried now she doesn't remember it. She's kind of buried those memories. But I think it's also equally possible that she was writing them unconsciously, either, if you're a believer through paranormal means, or if you're a skeptic, it is possible to be unconscious of these actions, to have kind of dissociative behavior. So it takes you into incredibly interesting realms, but also realms that are quite difficult to talk about as well. It's a sort of frightening idea for Shirley.
Yeah, it certainly is.
It really is scary. Oh, and so we kind of following quite nicely on actually to your conversation about whether this kind of thing still takes place. Ruth Forsyth is asking, hi folks, are you aware of any more recent paranormal investigations in the house or on the site?
So the house doesn't exist anymore. The house kind of has ceased to exist, I think, in the late 60s. And indeed, that whole stretch of the road has gone. So, I mean, people were really enjoying doing detective work on this and trying to work out where the house would have been. They, getting out old maps. Like, people were going right back to 18th century maps, trying to find what was on the site. But people were able to kind of pin down roughly where the house was. I mean, what I would say to anybody doing that is, I would say, be respectful of the fact that there are people living in a house on that site now, and we have no idea of how they would feel about, that the fact that their house is on the site of where Shirley's was. I mean, I don't feel it had so much to do with the house. It feels like it was much more to do with the personalities of the family. I mean, it's so hard to know with these things. how much the house played a part. We know that the phenomena followed Shirley outside of the house. I mean, it's really interesting playing that detective game of trying to track down the house. I mean, no investigations have taken place on the site since, and the house doesn't exist as an entity to investigate. So no is the answer to that, I guess. But it's been really fascinating seeing people probe that area and trying to work out if there's anything. People going back looking at, environmental things to do with the area. Was there anything on that site before? Had anything happened on the site? I think that's been part of the fun of the process. And long may that continue, I guess.
A few more questions to go through. We've had a few questions from the movie streamer. So I'm going to ask a couple of these ones. He asks, is Danny knowledgeable on haunting in the US? Visited the Whaley House in Old Town San Diego a few years ago. The most haunted house in the States, apparently. Are you aware of that one, Danny?
I'm going to write that down now and look it up, the Whaley House. But I mean, I'm sort of aware of some hauntings in the States, but not as much as I'd like to be. And, brilliantly, I've been, sent lots of ghost stories from the States as part of this process. And, I'd have a real interest in telling a story from the States. And clearly it's as rich with ghosts as Britain. I think it's really interesting, actually, for me about seeing how America and Britain both have such rich ghost traditions. And I think I'm right in saying, and I'm borrowing this from a brilliant writer called Roger Clark, who wrote A Natural History of Ghosts, which is a great book for anybody interested in the subject. And he talks about how ghost story traditions in Britain started after the Civil War in the 1600s as a way of, again, processing the loss of life and the trauma of that. And, you see that First World War, Second World War, people reach for ghosts. And I believe that in America, the ghost story tradition started after their Civil War in the 1800s. So there's an interesting parallel there. And my wife is Swedish, and there just isn't the same kind of ghost story tradition in Sweden, and they're just not as interested in ghosts. And I do wonder if there's that very, the Swedes are quite sensible, quite rational beings, and I just wonder if something about Americans and Brits, and of course American, the first settlers were Brits coming from Britain to America. So I wonder if there is if we have some sort of commonality there about our approach to how we process death, and our need for ghosts. Ghosts clearly play a real important role in both our societies that maybe they don't play so much in some other countries.
Could be quite right there. Actually, before I move on to Rebecca's next one, the movie studio did just ask as well, what was that moved behind Danny just then?
Oh, that would definitely be my ghost, yeah. I don't know. I'm in the shed in my garden, so if the movie streamer's trying to convince me that it's haunted, that's going to be a problem, because I spend a lot of time in here at night, so that would be quite creepy. But it's recently built. It's about 5 years old, so I'm hoping that it's not possessed, and it's painted in very, I don't know if you can see, it's painted in very sort of Scandi chic white. So it's not as creepy as it maybe looks.
You'll be right. I was going to say kudos to Rebecca for the most apt lighting that you've got there tonight, Rebecca. So well done.
I've gone for spooky.
Very much so, yeah.
So Rich Rue 2001 is asking, do you think our level of concentration is lower, so people don't spend time nowadays thinking about abstract events that happen to them in the same way?
I think that is a brilliant question. I think that yes, you could make that case, couldn't you? I mean, I think we are way less connected to our environments because we're way more connected to these screens in front of us. So you notice things less. Absolutely, we're not as plugged into the sounds around us, the changes in light, the kind of the rustles of leaves, the rustles of the wind. And we in a former age, we were walking through streets lit by gas lamps with the fog swirling around us, and we were plunged into creepy environments at all times. We're sitting on train platforms with steam trains coming past, and you feel like those places lend themselves to ghost stories, and perhaps that's just because so many ghost stories contain those elements. But we definitely are less in tune with our environments, I think, and we are consuming our world through our screens way more. But as I said earlier, I'm really interested in how ghost traditions continue in the modern world. And there was a really interesting thing which happened on Twitter, and I'm going to misremember this now, but there was a guy who was talking about a ghost in his house, and he'd woken up in the middle of the night and taken photographs. I think I'm going to say it's something like Dear David, and maybe somebody listening will know about this and correct me. But he was like waking up and taking a photograph with his phone and capturing an image of a ghostly child on his phone, and it was really creepy. And he told this over a series of tweets over quite a long period of time. I think it was like weeks or maybe even months, and it really gripped people. And it was this kind of Twitter ghost story that felt very real. And I think it was a hoax. I think it was all, I think he was a writer of some sort, as a TV writer, and I think he was doing it as a kind of attention grabbing kind of thing. But it was brilliantly creepy, and it was a real interesting way of how you can tell a ghost story through the medium of your smartphone, capturing images and then relaying it to Twitter, to people on Twitter in short installments. So, that's interesting, and that's something that is very much about the modern world. That is, him using his smartphone to capture a haunted moment. So whilst we may not be as in tune with the little rustles and shadows and all that sort of thing, we can find our ghosts in other ways.
Last couple of questions that we've got coming in, actually. Steve, this is to all of us, apparently. Have any of the panel experienced anything supernatural? I live around the corner from a poltergeist. That was about the limit. I didn't see anything on the nights that I spent in the haunted pub either, which was very disappointing. Apparently all happened after I left. Wouldn't you know it? I don't know about you, Rebecca. What about you?
It's a good question. I've had a couple of experiences that I wondered about. One of them was when I was a little kid, and I was convinced that I saw an old lady with a tartan shopping trolley going into the downstairs bathroom of my grandparents' house. When I went and told my family, they all laughed at me. And I remember it really clearly because I remember being outraged. that they were laughing at me, and she was just there. So goodness knows what that was. But of course, I used to work in Pontefract as the editor of the paper there, and one of my reporters went off to cover a haunting of a local charity shop, if I remember rightly, and we did do some stuff around the Black Monk of Pontefract as well. So, I mean, Danny, you have so much fodder for future work, don't you?
I mean, it's interesting, though, you were talking about your experience, and those childhood experiences are so powerful. I've had a lot of people contact me telling me a story that happened to them during childhood, and something that they've never been able to shake. It is that moment that really stays with you, and because it's confusion of not being able to explain it, and sometimes fear tied up with it, but it leaves this imprint that people sort of say, even like 30, 40 years later, they still remember that so vividly. I've had nothing happen to me, and not for want of trying, and I do feel like I kind of live vicariously for the stories people have told me, because I would describe myself as a skeptic who wants to believe, and I am fascinated by the profundity and transformative nature of seeing a ghost. Once you have that moment, there's no way back. You've seen that thing. You can't go back to being somebody who doesn't believe in ghosts. And it's such a powerful moment. And I've spoken to a few people who resolutely don't believe in ghosts, but feel they have seen one, and just cannot get over the moment that they felt like that. One of the episodes we did of Haunted, set in South Africa. I don't know if anyone's heard this one, but it's a moment where this guy is describing the vision he's had, the experience he's had. And as a kind of rational outsider, you can look at this thing and you feel like, to me, this feels like a dream. It feels like a nightmare. But it was so real to him. The fear he felt was so real that even though he's a skeptic. He doesn't believe in ghosts. He cannot get over that moment. The fear he felt is such that he is kind of convinced that this was a ghost. And it's the power of that moment. And that's always fascinated me, the power of that moment, the kind of life-changing power of that. And in a way, I've wished I had that. And then at the same time, I kind of know, be careful what you wish for. And I was talking to a guy called Barry Dodds, who's an interesting guy. He's a comedian and a paranormal investigator. He does a show called The Parapod. And he was saying the same. I mean, he's a real believer, but he said he'd always wished he could see a ghost and have this moment. And then he had this experience. And he says, be careful what you wish for, because it was such a terrifying experience. And he had, he was so shaken by it afterwards. And so I've got that in my head, I guess. I'm a scaredy cat. I'm a real coward, And so as much as I would love to have this life-changing moment, I also kind of am slightly nervous about the idea of it as well. So if I just carry on having it vicariously from other people, I think I'll be kind of happy about that as well.
Which probably sounds quite sane. I was actually going to ask this question as a sort of like a couple of wrap-up ones. Richard, has Amazon or Netflix called yet? And would you go down that route? Could you give us the exclusive now?
I can't. I mean, there have been people interested in the TV side of things, because clearly it is a really good story, and people love a ghost story, and people particularly love a poltergeist story, I think, because it's such a tangible, it's the most tangible of ghosts. That idea that you witness things flying through the room is so powerful, and finding a poltergeist story that hasn't been done to death and covered in the way that Enfield has clearly excited people. It's excited the paranormal community. It's excited the press, and so that there has been some interest in doing a TV version of it, and sort of we'll chat about that. And if that happens, that would be beautiful and lovely and really nice. But I mean, at the moment, I'm just really enjoying the fact that the podcast has gone down well with people, and it's just so lovely to see it enjoyed and to feel that there is a little bit of a community that's built around it. And we'll be back with episode 9, which this is an exclusive for you. I can tell you it will be released on the 9th of April at 9:00. So 999. Not sure yet if that's 9 a.m. or 9 p.m. We'll have to decide. We'll have to decide on that and see if it feels like the morning or the evening's more appropriate. But so we'll release that on the 9th of April, and that will be a chance to do a bit more of a deep dive on the case and explore some things that are still puzzling, that and also some new things that have come up, some new evidence that's come through, another new witness. So I mean, I like this is the case that keeps on giving for me. I like the fact that it doesn't have to be a finished thing. The feed is here, and if we find new things, if there's new bits of the story to tell, then we'll come back and tell that, and at the same time, the BBC would like us to do another season of this and find a new case and do another investigation. So we're sort of just starting to think about what that might be as well. So yeah.
Well, I'm already excited. One for the Netflix show, and the second season of what I'm hoping is going to be the Abbott Road Poltergeist from Bournemouth. That would be my personal choice. Listen, I don't know if Rebecca's got anything else, but I think we've kept you too long. I think, Danny, I could talk to you all night. I really could.
I'm going to go and have my dinner now. But, no, thank you. That was a real pleasure and nice to chat to people and lovely to take questions.
Yeah, it's been so good. Thank you, Danny.
Thanks very much, Danny. Really, really appreciate your time. And obviously, download whatever Danny does next, and keep a lookout, obviously, for Netflix domination in the very. Thank you very much for joining us this evening, and keep your eye out on Yorkshire Voice as well for more of these live Q&As coming up over the next few weeks and months. Thanks very much for joining.